Okay, so you heard my musings in the intro. Let's see if we can use our next couple of lectures to find a better way forward. And I want to begin that with this lecture, talking about how do we advocate for young people through practical theology. Now, in your readings that you're going to be doing and you're in the midst of, I think there's some important things for us to think about. First of all, Catherine Turpin and Ann Walker talks about, they say this in the first chapter of their book. They say the dreams of young people matter. Now, we might think in this class, well, of course, that's just a given that they matter. But I think sometimes young people's dreams are misunderstood. They're seen as irrelevant or just a fleeting thought or something that's not important to them. But I think what I love about what Turpin and Walker say is that dreams aren't just expressions of wishful thinking. They're an active expression of the hope that allow people to survive and thrive. We know from research and we know from a lot of the work that we do with young people that this idea of dreams fuel resiliency. They're what keep kids going, no matter what the world has handed them. We find that oftentimes young people are the ones that still continue to have hope. And these hopes, again, are not just wishful thinking. They are deeply grounded in this desire to want to make it in this world. And so what we have to do when we think about advocating for young people is to pay close attention to what these dreams are communicating. We nurture young people's dreams by increased intentionality and awareness. So we have to step in a little bit closer and truly understand young people in order for us to really nurture these dreams that matter to young people. Now, they also quote a poet, Langston Hallam Hughes, and he's asked this question: what happens to a dream deferred? And he uses pretty visceral language in his reflection. He said, what happens when they're deferred? Do they shrivel up like a raisin? Do they stank like rotten meat? Do they explode? What happens? And so perhaps when we think about the dreams of young people in youth ministry and in the work that we do in advocating for young people, sometimes perhaps we feel this low-grade urgency. Now, this isn't the panic that I've talked about before, where we have to chase after every relevant thing and put out every cultural fire in order to protect young people. But there is an urgency in the sense that young people can't wait for churches to get their act together. Like we can't wait a decade of their lives before they can realize their dreams. They are in many ways conceptualizing, exploring, refining, defining the deep down calling that they sense and feel in their lives to thrive and to survive, that they need to actually act upon. And so I think in youth ministry, oftentimes feel a deep pull to not only patiently lead young people and at the same time recognize the fact that they are on a trajectory where they need help and support now, not down the road. And so I think with that comes a bit of urgency as we not only think about how we help young people, but how we communicate the needs of their young people to older generations, typically that don't always sense the urgency or are able to capture or see the dreams of young people and why it's so important to them. So we play this really, really interesting role that's really, really crucial in the work that we do. Now, unfortunately, I think sometimes what happens is, and this often comes from too many well-intentioned youth leaders out there, is that when we talk about dreams or we talk about the needs of young people or we talk about what's happening in youth culture today, someone will inevitably in my lectures or in my presentations raise their hand and just kind of say, we just need to give them Jesus. To which I deep down reply, of course they need Jesus. Well, Jesus is the hope. Jesus is the good news. Jesus is the reality that calls us to the best kind of life that a person can live, that you and I can live. But I think if we're not careful, this sort of phrase can turn into a sort of a trite, generalized, reactive, instinctual response that just doesn't have a lot of weight or teeth or empathy associated with it. As a matter of fact, it can actually begin to sound a bit numbing. Turpin and Walker talk about the fact that we can actually almost have a tone-deaf ministry where we don't pay attention to the particularities or the contours of young people's lives to really understand the dreams that they're longing to aspire to and work through in their lives. And instead, we give them trite Jesus answers that somehow is supposed to solve the problem. And that not only makes us tone deaf, but if we're not careful, we can actually, in the spirit of serving young people, actually dehumanize them. Okay, so there's something deep and profound about what we are called to do. And one of the ways that I often talk about it is I think sometimes if we're not careful, we can do ministry at a distance. Where we are unwilling to get close enough to see, feel, understand, empathize with young people and their lives. And as a result, we stand at a difference and we lob platitudes their way. And we can say things that are gospel-y and Jesus-y, but at a distance, they're simply shouted, they're not embodied. And the gospel communicated at a distance is really no gospel at all. You see, youth ministry is like we got to get close. We're going to feel it too. We're going to have to look young people in the eye and seek to understand where they're coming from and recognize the fact that it's probably going to wreck us along the way. That's hard and it's challenging, and I think it can sometimes be overwhelming. And that's why I love thinking about this idea of practical theology so much, because I think that practical theology provides us a way to step closer to young people without panicking and thinking that we're putting out fires. Okay, so practical theology may be something that's that is new to you. Perhaps it's something that you are familiar with. Perhaps you've taken another class at Fuller and you've talked about it. Perhaps you had it in undergrad. I just want to give you a brief overview of what practical theology is and explain to you how I think it can help us as we think about the way that we lead change, the way that we lead youth ministry, and where we go from that. So practical theology really has four key movements that most practical theologians agree on. There's different nuances with it, which we don't have time to get into, but let me just give you what that is. First of all, there's this move of asking the question, what's going on? This is a descriptive empirical task, and it simply is the discipline that we have of trying to describe what's happening in a particular person's life or in, say, our ministry environment or in the culture that we are a part of. And this description is really important because oftentimes I think what it's human nature to do is to see something, and instead of describing it, we interpret it. Look at those kids over there. They're on their phones. They're always on their phones. They don't care about relationships. They don't care about community. Notice what's happening there. They see a behavior and they've attached a value to that, and they are making a judgment on a behavior without really seeking to understand what's going on in the particular behavior. Anthropologist Clifford Geertz talks about this idea that the goal of the anthropologist is to make the familiar strange and the strange familiar. And the point that he's getting at is that sometimes two people can do the same things, but they can have different meanings. And sometimes two people can do different things, but actually they have the same meaning. And the only way that we understand that is to step a little bit closer and truly pay attention and describe and understand what the action, what the situation actually, what's actually happening within that role. So part of our job is to just be honest about describing what's happening, because that's going to help us in our assessment before we jump to making meaning of it. Now, secondly, we do ask the question, well, why is it going on? And this is where the interpretive task comes in. This becomes really, really important. We not only describe it, but then we certainly want to be asking this why question of like, well, why are they acting that way? Why is this going on? Why are these things happening in our community? And so we begin to ask this why question, which will become really important. And I'll explain more about that in a second. The third move is this idea of asking the question, what ought to be going on? And this is the normative task. We may see something happening. We may try to define why it's happening. But then I think we ask the question, this is a value judgment of saying, well, what ought to be going on? Is this good? Is this bad? Could it be better? How do we know? And how do we think about that? And then that moves us to this idea of how might we respond? Like in light of what we see and how we're interpreting it and what we think ought to be happening, how do we move, act, respond, anticipate as individuals or as a community? Now, if we were to take these four movements a little bit more, we could look at it this way, that what's going on really is about this idea of encounter. This is where we are trying to describe what's going on from a human standpoint, but also trying to discern what the Spirit is doing within a particular situation. So what is God doing? What are people doing? How can we describe what's happening in a particular moment or in a particular time frame or with a particular person or a particular community? We describe and we try to pay attention to what's going on in people and what the Spirit is doing in our midst, okay? We believe that the Spirit is working, right? We believe that that people are having experiences, and what we're trying to do is pay attention to that because it's going to help us understand what's going on, at least to be able to describe it more clearly, which will help our understanding. That really moves to this idea of what's going on, and this is where the social sciences come in, okay? This is where we're able to think about psychology or sociology or development or whatever it might be, to add some frames to what we've observed. And this is really, really helpful because we might see a particular action of a young person, and we may recognize the fact that the way that they are acting, the way that they are thinking, the things that they are feeling are actually right on time with regards to their developmental stage or their appropriateness, right? It would be wrong for us to superimpose an adult psyche on a 12-year-old. That wouldn't be right. At the same time, it would be inappropriate to impose a 12-year-old psyche on a 25-year-old, right? So I think what we have is through the social sciences, we have the opportunity to appreciate race, ethnicity, orientation, gender. We can think about social forces. We can think about development that often allows us to have an appreciation of what we've observed to better understand what's going on. And we're able to turn these experiences and try to understand them more. This really leads to the third move, and that's this idea of what ought to be going on. And this is where we bring theology to bear on our work. We ask the question, well, what does the gospel call for here? What is God wanting us to do? Is our actions perpetuating good news, or in some ways are they hindering good news? So what does a person need to be invited into? Where can they be affirmed? Where do they need to be corrected, right? Theology allows us to ask the bigger, more compelling questions about what's going on so that we can minister and lead people well, which then leads to the fourth move, which is how we respond. And I'm just going to call this ministry, right? This is where we act upon our reflection. We've described it. We've tried to interpret it. We've tried to evaluate it. And now what we're going to do is we're going to make a ministry move to help an individual or our community make a next faithful step. Now, what I love about the way that I'm depicting practical theology, and it's usually done this way, is that you'll see it's a circular motion, right? So after we make that next faithful step, what do? Well, we begin to describe, interpret, we bring theology to bear, and then we make another move and we keep moving forward. So the Christian life is really about that next faithful step, isn't it? I remember one time as a leader, I had an anxious elder come up to me because I was making some ministry decisions, and this person was a little anxious about some of the choices I was making. And they said to me, whatever you do, you better just make sure you do it right. Now, that is not an encouraging statement to get from an elder of church, okay, when you're the pastor, right? Because basically what was being communicated to me is like, there's one way, you're going to make that move, it better be right. And if it's not right, you're going to be in trouble, right? It seems to me that true ministry is an iterative process where we're constantly observing, assessing, dreaming, moving, observing, assessing, assessing, dreaming, moving. And we're taking small iterative steps of faithfulness to advocate for young people, to help them in their discipleship journeys, to help our communities move in that direction. And I think what I love about practical theology is it gives us hope, that the work that we do isn't about just getting it right. It's about prayerfully and carefully reflecting and helping people take their next faithful steps. So what if we were to think of youth ministry in that sort of way? A commitment to a step closer to teenagers, a commitment to understand what they see, a devotion to listening before describing, thinking of it as a mutual task, and it's sort of an in-motion endeavor that invites us to take the next faithful step. I believe that this sort of approach can in many ways calm our fears and help us think about ways that we can faithfully lead those that we feel called to lead. So that just leaves us with maybe a couple of things to think about. Like when you think about practical theology and ministry, what of these four moves might youth leaders tend to leave out? Or where do you think youth leaders get stuck? And maybe just think about that. I think it'd be kind of fun to do that. Also, how might practical theology help youth leaders respond rather than react to young people's dreams, right? We've talked about that. And then how do youth leaders' roles need to shift in order to make this possible? What kind of leader do you need to be to evoke practical theology in your ministry? Do you have time to work through this cycle? I would say if you don't, perhaps there's something for you to think about there. And I think we can help each other with that. So I hope you find this encouraging. And we will keep thinking about this as we unfold our thinking in this class. Peace.